Hello folks, this is Sullla again, giving you a recap on the final day of IEM Kiev in the finals. Now, I was planning on having this up yesterday, but yesterday was a really tough day locally here in Baltimore as our American football team just suffered a absolutely devastating defeat in the conference championships for American football. So it was a pretty tough day. Wasn't really in the mood to go and talk about League of Legends yesterday, but in any case, that's not what you guys want to hear about. You want to hear about the League of Legends and the finals for IEM Kiev. So going to talk a little bit about that, give you some of my thoughts on how the final played out. For those who didn't see, in the finals, Moscow 5 did emerge victorious, beating Team Solomid 2-1 in some pretty good games. Again, none of them were all that close. They all did tend to snowball, but still 2-1. Moscow 5 coming out on top. Solomid did manage to win a game off them, and that was the first game that Moscow 5 lost in the whole tournament. So we're going to look at each one of the games and talk a little bit about what happened, and then try to make some conclusions overall coming out of this tournament. So in the first game, let me give you the sides. Solomid was running Sona Graves in bottom lane. They were running Irelia in top lane, Cassiopeia in mid, and Skarner in jungle. Meanwhile, Moscow 5 was running, they were running Taric and Kog'maw in bottom lane. They were running Lee Sin in jungle. They were running Shyvana in top lane, so they're running Shyvana in top and not just jungling, and then Galio in mid. Really, the biggest issue in this game was that Moscow 5 was able to go and steal the blue buff from Solomid. They were able to take a blue very early on in the game, I think at about the 8 or 9 minute mark. And then once they're able to get that blue steal, they had the timer for the blue. So they were able to deny Solomid's Cassiopeia that blue buff. And with Galio having a blue and Solomid not having their own blue, they were just able to start pushing them out of middle lane. And then that really started to set up everything else on the map. By having that pressure on middle lane, Moscow 5 was able to invade really aggressively elsewhere on the map. They were able to invade the jungle in top. What they were doing was their laner in top. It was Darian playing Shyvana in top. He kept pushing to tower, and then he would just aggressively invade the jungle over and over again. He kept stealing the wolves, and he was taking part in counter jungling. So he was just running all over the map unopposed, and Solomid couldn't really push back against that because they were being pushed so aggressively in mid. So both mid and top were being pushed aggressively, and then that opened up the counter jungling play. Then in a couple of team fights, there was one team fight where Galio got off a really good ultimate, and then that set them up. I think they scored a triple kill at Dragon, and from there the game just snowballed. So Moscow 5 was able to take that one, and really it was all about taking that first blue, being able to steal that blue buff, because then Moscow 5 had the timer, and with control over both blues, they were just able to put so much pressure on both mid and top that it was really difficult for Solomid to do anything in that game. Now in the second game, Solomid was able to do much better. In that game, Solomid was playing, let's see, I have the picks here, they're playing Sivr Sona in bottom lane. They were able to take Lee Sin as their own jungler. Then they were running Cassiopeia in mid again and Tryndamere in top. That was against Moscow 5, which was running Nunu and Kog'Maw in bottom lane. They were running Mordekaiser in mid. They were running Irelia in top, and they had Shyvana jungling for that game. This game really was kind of won in the first 2 minutes of the game. Solomid was able to catch Moscow 5 in the first 2 minutes before the minions spawned. They're actually able to score both first blood and then a second kill as well. So they actually got 2 kills before minions even spawned early on in the game, and Moscow 5 had just gotten split up. They weren't all together. Solomid was able to catch them in like a 5-on-2 situation. They were able to get 2 kills, and even more importantly, the kills went on to Tryndamere in top lane and then on to Sivr in bottom lane. So they had 2 of their carries getting first blood. And honestly, it really just kind of snowballed from there because Moscow 5 was behind from the very beginning. They tried to gank Cassiopeia in mid, Solomid's Cassiopeia, and it backfired. They weren't able to get that. Reginald was actually able to get a kill on Mordekaiser early on. So Moscow 5 wasn't able to do what they like to do in that game, which is push lanes and then aggressively counter jungle. They weren't able to do that. Once they fell behind, they weren't able to invade the enemy team's jungle, because if they did that, they just would have been killed. So they couldn't run the strategy that had been running so effectively in other games. And once they got behind 5-0 in kills, Solomid just completely snowballed from there, and it ended up being a really crushing win. Solomid actually won 19-3 in champion kills and just completely dominated. So that was really a case of just early in the game, Solomid getting first blood, getting 2 kills before minions spawned, and then from there, there were a couple ganks in mid that didn't work out, where Reginald's Cassiopeia was able to get some kills, And from there, the game was basically just over because Solomid didn't make any mistakes. And that's something that you often see at high-level play in these tournaments. In solo queue, people make mistakes all the time. You know, you can screw up early on and you can come back. But when teams are really playing at a high level, if you fall behind and you don't make any mistakes, the game's just over because teams just start pushing lanes. They take all the neutral buffs. They invade and steal red and blue. They take every dragon. They take Baron when it spawns. I mean, it's people. I heard some people complaining that it was boring, but actually it's just a sign that the teams are playing really, really well. And I thought both Moscow 5 and Solomid played really well all throughout this tournament because neither one lost to any of the other teams. And I thought that they both played pretty well in the finals as well. Anyway, getting to the last game, so we did actually have a game 3 here. This was the first time in the tournament we had a best of 3 match actually go to the third and deciding game. So in that last game, picks were really important. Moscow 5 ended up picking Sona and AD Kennen. So yes, breaking out the AD Kennen again for their bottom lane. Then Mordekaiser in mid, Shyvana in top lane, and Skarner in the jungle. Meanwhile, Solomid was running Lee Sin in the jungle. They were running Sivr Alistar in their bottom lane, and that's the first time we saw Alistar in this tournament. Then they're running Karthus in mid and Irelia in top lane. Now, a lot of people think that Solomid ended up losing this game on the picking screen, and there's a lot of evidence that does kind of support that. They had some bad matchups in this particular matchup. All throughout the tournament, Moscow 5 and Solomid, people had been banning Karthus, and so Solomid thought that they would pick Karthus in mid in order to deny it to Moscow 5. But as it turned out, that kind of backfired because Moscow 5 picked Mordekaiser instead, and that's kind of a bad matchup for Karthus because Mordekaiser is just going to push the lane really hard, and it's difficult for Karthus to harass. So in order for Karthus to do well in that mid matchup, he needs to take his own blue, really needs to control his own blue. And as it turned out in this game, Moscow 5 was actually able to start counter jungling and run their blue denial strategy again, and it actually worked pretty well. But really the biggest issue was actually in top lane. In top lane, it was Shyvana for Moscow 5 being played by Darian, and that was against Irelia being played by Rainman. This has been something that's been criticized a lot. Most people have been saying on the forums they think that Irelia was a very poor pick. Irelia was actually the last pick in that match, was picked after Shyvana had already been picked in top lanes, and I do agree with that. It wasn't a particularly good pick. In the first game, they had played the exact same matchup, and Shyvana had dominated that matchup in the first game, so Solomid probably should have thought about picking a different champion there since it had gone so poorly in the first game. Anyways, it turned out the Moscow 5 was able to get ahead early on. They were able to just out-farm the lanes early on. They were able to dominate in bottom lane. Actually, the bottom lane for Solomid, which has been so strong throughout the tournament, the Sivr Alistar lane that Chaos and X Special was running, they were struggling early on. I didn't see exactly what was happening because the camera work wasn't on bottom lane, but that AD Kennen Sona lane really had total control of bot early on. Kennen was actually ahead like 20 minion kills at about the 10-minute mark or so. So they had Sivr pushed to the tower, wasn't able to do the normal strategy, and that's probably partly due to the fact that it was Sivr Alistar, which is not a great laning combination. So once again, Moscow 5 did first pick Sona and was just really able to bully around that bottom lane. So with bottom lane being pushed to their tower, with mid being pushed to the tower, that allowed Moscow 5 to do some really aggressive counter jungling again. And that was really set up by Darian in top lane as Shyvana. He would just push the tower, and then he would go and jungle invade. He would go and steal golems. He would go and try to steal red buff, etc. Now, a lot of people have criticized again and said, hey, Solomid, you've got to stop their counter jungling. It's not that Solomid wasn't aware of that. This is something that people have missed on the forum. Solomid knew what they were doing. They knew very well that Moscow 5 was trying to counter invade. And in fact, in the first 10 minutes of the game, you saw several jungle fights where Solomid would immediately, run to where the counter jungling was taking place and try to stop it. But the problem was they fell behind because that Shyvana in top lane for Moscow 5 kept taking their jungle buffs. That meant that the jungler for Solomid, odd one playing Lee Sin, he fell behind in levels. He actually got really under-leveled. And once that happened, they weren't able to stop the counter jungling. Solomid fell behind in levels, and then there was one fight, I think around about the 10 to 15 minute mark, where Solomid and Moscow 5 had a big fight in the top lane jungle, and Solomid got triple killed. 3 deaths for Solomid, no kills. Moscow 5 went 3-0 in the fight. And after that point in time, Moscow 5 was just too far ahead. Solomid knew they were counter jungling, but they couldn't stop it because if they tried to fight, they were just going to lose. And it really just snowballed from there. Honestly, it just was a snowball from there. Once Solomid got behind, then they really couldn't stop the invasions. And from there, the game just snowballed once again. It ended up that Solomid had to commit everything to try to stop a Baron by Moscow 5, and they lost, they got aced, and then the game was just over. And that was, again, a short game. It was just 26 minutes. And Moscow 5 actually won 14-2 in kills. So again, common things that people have said on the forums. Why didn't Solomid ban Shyvana? Which is a really good question. I'm kind of wondering that as well. Shyvana was so integral to everything that Moscow 5 was doing. They ran it in top lane twice with Darien. They ran it in jungle once with Diamonds. In fact, Moscow 5 played Shyvana in every single game in this tournament, except one game where Against All Authority banned it. But literally every single other game they played Shyvana, and it was just so integral to what they were doing. They were using Shyvana's great movement speed and her AoE damage that allows her to clear the jungle so fast. It was really the integral to everything that they were doing. Their counter jungling strategy, their pushing strategy. So why they didn't ban Shyvana is a really good question, and I honestly don't know that. I guess that Solomid thought that they could deal with her, but apparently they couldn't. So that's one of the biggest questions, and it is a really legitimate complaint. The other thing is most people are scapegoating Rain Man, and I think that that's a little bit unfair. It's true that Rain Man did not play particularly well. People who have watched Solomid for a long time, I think there's pretty wide agreement that Rain Man is the weakest member of their team. He rarely wins top lane, and he just got abused when he played Irelia against the Shyvana of Darien. I agree that that was a big issue, but at the same time, Rain Man isn't the only one making these calls. When they picked Irelia in the last game, they did choose that as a team. That wasn't an individual choice, so it's a little unfair to scapegoat Rain Man. And the other reason why the Shyvana invasions, jungle invasions, were so successful is because there was no pressure mid and because there was no pressure bot. Bottom lane was being pushed to the tower in that last game. Middle lane was being pushed to the tower. Alex playing as Mordekaiser was just pushing Reginald to his tower over and over again. And that's what sets up those jungle invasions. This is something that people need to realize. It's not that Shyvana was just running into the jungle and no one knew what she was doing. No, solo mid knew what Moscow 5 was doing, but there was so much pressure on mid and bottom and in top lane that they couldn't stop it. So it was really an overall team effort. It wasn't just that Rain Man was so bad. Admittedly, he didn't play great, but it was really a team effort. Moscow 5 was setting up their whole team to be pushing and jungle invading and jungle denying, and Solomid just as a team wasn't able to stop that in the first and in the third games. Largely due to the fact that they weren't able to hold on to their blue buff in those games because Moscow 5 did a great job of invading and denying. And then if you can't keep pressure on middle lane, then it's very easy for the other team to go in and jungle invade. So anyway, I've rambled on long enough. This is getting to be longer than I wanted it to be, but just wanted to give some thoughts. I did think the tournament was very interesting to watch. Moscow 5 living up to the pre-tournament expectations. I actually thought Solo Mid played much better than I expected to. They had not looked good in scrimmages coming into this tournament, but I thought they really played well. It was just Moscow 5 played a little bit better. So it'll be fun to see where these teams go from here. And when the big tournament happens in Hanover in about 2 months, should be really exciting to see all the big teams get together and find out how everything goes. So anyway, once again, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed this series. Going to have some regular League of Legends videos up soon, probably tomorrow. Until then, take care, and I'll see you guys again soon.